Making prints of any kind is a pretty wonderful operation.
Although it's very impressive to look at Dürer's woodcuts, etchings, and engravings without understanding the process, once you really do understand the process, then you have a better sense of the technical virtuosity that made Dürer famous during his own lifetime.
Well, the thing about a woodcut is that it's kind of counterintuitive.
Take a block of wood and you carve into it with a tool. But in this case, we've used what's called a linoleum cut, which is just like a piece of linoleum you would see on your kitchen floor. This is much easier to carve into with a tool.
You can have different kinds of implements, different shapes, different cross-sections, and they're basically like miniature ice cream scoops. You cut into the wood with the scoop part of the tool and remove some of the wood.
So you take a tool and you actually dig out the areas that are going to print white.
Imagine how much control you would need when using these engraving tools to produce cuts and gouges and scoops into the wood with this kind of precision.
All the areas that you carve out will in fact print white, but the areas that are left in relief, which is to say the areas that are not cut out, will print black. What you can see here is where the angel is carrying the cross. The areas that are dug out in the parallel lines are in fact the ones that will print white.
You might assume that the black lines have been drawn, but in fact it's exactly the opposite. The black lines have been untouched, and the areas between them are the bits that have been scooped away by using the gouges and the engraving tools. It's really difficult to do because if you're not completely in control of the implements that you're using, then it's really easy to go kind of, to start cutting a very deliberate groove into the surface and then to go kind of careering off the end. And, you end up with a line that's out of control. Once you've actually removed all the pieces of wood that you don't want to hold ink, you're ready for printing. Then what you do is you roll ink across the surface. It stays on the untouched, uncut surfaces of the wood, but it doesn't go into the recessed parts where you've removed wood from the surface of the block. And then you place a piece of paper over the top, and you can either rub the back of the paper with your hand or with the back of a spoon or with an implement that presses the paper into the ink, or you can run it through a press so that the paper and the ink touch each other, and when you peel the paper off carefully, then you get the ink transferred to the paper, and that's how you end up with the final print. So an engraving is almost the exact opposite of a woodcut. You take a piece of metal, usually copper, and it's beautifully polished so you can see your reflection in it.
And you use tools, which are called burins, and you actually gouge out little slivers of the copper.
Using an enormous amount of manual control, you incise lines across and into the surface of the metal. By varying the amount of pressure, you can change the character of the line that you're actually incising into the metal. So if you press very gently, you get a relatively shallow incised line, and that would in the end print as a fine line in the engraving. But if you use a little more pressure, then the burin goes deeper into the metal, it gouges out a deeper incised line into the surface, and when you print it eventually, that will hold more ink, and you'll end up with a darker, thicker black line.
And you can see here from the pressure of the hand, it's really very difficult to gouge out these deep lines. So with the engravings, you can gouge out a very long, thin piece, or you can take a different kind of instrument and just flick out little tiny bits. If you look here at the top of this engraving, the lines that radiate out from the comet and the flying bat are straight lines. And then here with the dog, you see Dürer has used shorter cuts, shorter little flicks of the engraving tool to describe the hair on the dog.
And imagine trying to make different lines of different thickness by changing the pressure. It's almost impossible to imagine how anybody could really do that. Dura's really kind of amazing when you see the finished product.
When you've engraved all the lines that you want and you're finished engraving the plate, then you're ready for printing.
You ink the entire surface of the metal, you push ink all over every inch of the surface, and then gradually you begin to wipe the plate clean with a rag, removing the ink from the surface of the metal but leaving it trapped in the incised lines. So eventually you have a smooth piece of copper which has been cleaned, but ink has been left in the incised lines below the surface of the metal plate. Then you dampen some paper. The paper fibers soak up a little bit of the water and expand a little bit, so you put the paper on top of the plate, you cover the whole thing with some blankets, and then you pass the whole thing between two very heavy rollers. And the paper, the dampened paper, gets pushed into the grooves that you've cut into the surface of the metal, and it kisses the ink. And then when you peel the paper off, the ink is transferred from the incised lines to the surface of the paper, and that's how you end up with the engraving.
Now you can put another piece of paper on top of the copper plate and run it through the press again and again and again.
The point about engravings is that they look like drawings, but you can make as many copies of them as you wish. Each time you ink the plate and run it through the press, you get a separate print.
With an etching, the first step in the process is you cover the copper plate with a thin waxy ground.
And then when that layer dries, you can take a needle and draw through the varnish to produce lines, removing the wax as you go.
An etching can be done much more rapidly than an engraving can. An engraving takes an enormous amount of skill to press the burin through the copper plate, and quite a long time, whereas an etching can be done as quickly as a drawing.
You take the needle and you draw the lines you want through the wax, and those are the lines that are bitten by the acid.
So if you can see in the areas of the sky where there's parallel lines, those are the areas where Dürer would have taken his etching needle and drawn through the waxy ground that covers the plate. You take the copper plate, which is partially covered with the waxy ground and partially uncovered where you've drawn it, and you put the entire copper plate into an acid bath.
If you lower the plate gently into the acid bath using your finger, then at least you know you've only got acid on your finger and you can wash it off. If you throw it in from a distance, then it splashes all over the place and you've no idea where it's going to go, so that's dangerous. The acid then bites into the metal where you've drawn the lines, and it eats away the copper. As that happens, you can see little bubbles forming on the surface, and you might want to remove those with a feather, brushing them away so that they don't prevent the acid from biting more deeply into the copper. In an etching, you can produce lines of different depth by leaving the plate in the acid for different lengths of time.
Then you take the copper plate out of the acid bath, remove the waxy ground, and cover the entire plate with ink. Just like with engraving, you wipe off the surface of the plate and leave only the etched areas holding the ink. Then what you do is you take a piece of paper, put it over the copper plate, and run it through a press. The paper is pushed into the lines that hold the ink, and then you take the piece of paper off and you have your etching. Now you can continue to ink the plate and print it again and again. Dürer only made 6 etchings. We're not really sure why, but there's something that didn't please him about the etching process, and he didn't continue any further.